Our overall understanding of the mind and consciousness is still fairly rudimentary. The additional complexity with psychedelics is that we know that they induce these profound subjective experiences. The really important thing here is how the drug works is a secondary question to whether it works and whether it's safe. Those are the questions really that regulators care about. And for the purposes of proving that, there are validated scales of depression, for instance, the MADRS scale, which has been used across psychiatry. Those are the metrics that we're using to share with the FDA and other regulators. And that's ultimately what matters most, is safety and efficacy by these standardized and validated metrics.
Hey everyone, this week I'm delighted to be joined by Cosmo Feilding Mellen, a drug development entrepreneur, co-founder CEO of Beckley Psytech, which is a clinical stage biopharmaceutical company working to improve the lives of people with neuropsychiatric disorders by developing effective and rapid acting psychedelic medicines. Cosmo, pleasure to have you on the Healthtech Podcast. How are you doing, sir?
Yeah, good. Thanks, James. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome. First things first, whereabouts are you speaking to us from, Cosmo? Whereabouts are you guys based?
So we are actually primarily a virtual company. It was the company was founded in 2019, late 2019.
Yes.
And so inevitably it grew quite quickly during lockdown. And so we ended up as a virtual company. So I'm actually talking from home in Somerset right now, which is very nice.
Very nice.
Yeah.
Very nice. Yeah, I know that one. Starting a business, we were 2020. So
Yeah.
with the SomX side of things, and yes, fast growth. Great though. Pick up all your processes in a virtual world. All of a sudden, everyone's got the freedom and the flexibility. Makes hiring relatively straightforward when you're boasting flexible working.
So. I love it. We've got an office which we use here and there. I think it's nice to meet in person, but it is very nice to have that flexibility as well.
It is. Yeah, we had one of our team days yesterday, so we do monthly team days in London. Right. So we all got together and did a little bit of work, and mainly just a really long lunch, which was which was quite nice. And it was a case of, should we do anything now? Probably not. Let's just go home. So I think everyone kind of got what they wanted from me, which was ideal. Cool. Well, listen, absolute pleasure having you on. I have a huge interest in psychedelics. I've said this phrase many times before. I manipulated consciousness for a living as an anaesthetist, and so the nature of consciousness has always been something that's just been a fascination, I would say. Definitely when I was in my 20s, just once you end up reading about the nature of consciousness and trying to figure it out, and you sort of realize that as humans, there's something that we've missed, because this at some point atoms start contemplating atoms, however you dress it up, and so there's definitely something that we're missing there. And yes, it's a wave of reality or wavelength of reality, or however you want to describe it, that just consistently fascinates me. A checkered history, I guess, of psychedelics, which is interesting as well. But obviously, of late, people like yourselves, clinical trials into this stuff now, and as you quite rightly put in the introduction, the neuropsychiatric disorders having huge potential for treatment. So massively looking forward to getting into this with you. But I guess before we get into Beckley Psytech and everything that you're doing there, it'd be great to learn a bit more about you. You've got a fascinating background, which I will hand over to you actually to tell the listeners whatever side of that you wish to tell, because it's a story I've read a lot online. So yeah, don't want you to be bored of telling it.
No. Well, look, thank you, and I'll live up to the billing. But I guess I'll start. Someone who normally does live up to the billing is my mum. So basically, my co-founder of Beckley Psytech is actually my mother. She's called Amanda Feilding. She's been kind of involved in the field of kind of psychedelic research for half a century, but really most well known for setting up a non-profit called the Beckley Foundation in 1998. And so, again, a very, very, maybe for some context, a very kind of checkered history of psychedelic research. Albert Hofmann invented LSD and then subsequently invented psilocybin, which is the kind of synthesized psilocybin, which is the active ingredient of magic mushrooms. And that was in the kind of 40s. But in the 50s, research really kind of took off. And so back in the 50s, there was a huge amount of excitement that psychedelics were the kind of next big thing in kind of unlocking the subconscious mind. That's what the kind of terms they'd used back then. And there was a lot of research that was done in kind of really top universities around the world, like Harvard, on how these drugs could potentially be used to help psychiatric conditions like addiction, like depression, etc. But also how to kind of you could use these compounds just to kind of understand consciousness and the workings of the mind. It might help to kind of treat things even just through better understanding. Then what happened in the process basically was that people were experimented on during that period, both by kind of academics, also in fact by the CIA, also by the army. There was a load of different people looking at how to utilize these compounds. It was a well-known and still existing pharmaceutical company called Sandoz that invented these compounds. Well, Albert Hofmann was working for that company. So there was a lot of excitement. What ultimately happened was the drug started being used by people in a recreational fashion, got tied up with various kind of counterculture movements, and the drugs then became prohibited. So governments decided to make them illegal. And at that point, which was in the 60s, basically research ground to a halt. So there'd been, well over 1,000 papers written on these studies in the 50s and 60s. And then essentially no research happened for several decades. And so coming back to my story, the Beckley Foundation was set up in the 90s after this kind of long period of basically no research happening. And the motivation for starting this nonprofit that my mum ran and still runs was really that she felt these compounds were being ignored due to kind of cultural stigma rather than good scientific reasons. And so the aim of the foundation was to initiate early stage research in how these drugs work in the brain to better understand and kind of demystify what's going on in the brain, and also explore whether they could actually be used for benefit for patients particularly. So that's what started in the 90s. At that point, it was an extremely unfashionable subject. There'd basically been, this long period of no research. So it wasn't good for people's careers to get involved in this subject. And therefore, Beckley Foundation was one of very, very few groups that was kind of promoting the interest and research of in this area. And so it kind of became one of the kind of driving forces of what subsequently happened, which is over the last 20 years or so, there's been a huge resurgence of interest and research in this space, which we'll come on to. But so the Beckley Foundation, I suppose, played a very, very significant part in what's now called the kind of renaissance of psychedelic research, which is from the 90s, but it really picked up in the 2000s and kind of the last couple of decades, basically. So that was the Beckley Foundation story. And my mum's story, I grew up with that, essentially. So, I was 13 or something when the Beckley Foundation was started, and have really grown up with many of what are now deemed the kind of world-leading experts in this field as kind of friends and people that I've known for most of my life. And then, I worked with the Beckley Foundation for many years, and also worked in films and documentaries looking around this subject as well. And then basically about 9-10 years ago, with this resurgence of interest in the field, we realized there was this kind of opportunity to, I guess, take the next chapter. So the Beckley Foundation has been focused on really kind of initiating early stage academic research. And we suddenly were like, okay, we've got to the point now where there's actually the opportunity to go one step further, which is launch fully fledged drug development programs to make these compounds to the standard of regulatory approvals, and get them available for patients in need, so they can be prescribed for patients in need. And that requires, quite a different structure, a lot of different skills. It's a proper pharmaceutical drug development company. So about 10 years ago, we started looking at those kinds of opportunities together, and started one company which went very well, which we sold in 2019, and then started this one, which is really the main passion and the thing that we've always wanted to do. So that's a very quick history.
It's an awesome story, man, and obviously absolutely fascinating. I was even reading that Aldous Huxley stopped by to have a chat. Obviously, famously wrote Brave New World, and chatting about the nature of consciousness with people down there, which it's unbelievable to think that you've played such a part in the history of the UK almost. And you're right, it's been an interesting time, hasn't it, for psychedelics? That kind of initial 40s, 50s, 1,000 papers written, and all of a sudden everything's stopping in the 60s, picking up again in the 90s, but still stigmatized. Not a good idea to get involved if you're a scientist. But then of late, things have started to shift. That's obviously opened the door, probably at least in part, or maybe in a big way, due to what you were doing with the foundation, just helping that stigma change. But then the door slightly ajar to more scientific research that you've then really pushed open and are going through and taking that opportunity as an opportunity to push the space forwards. Why do you think that is? What is it? Is it the rise of mental health conditions, or at least the diagnosis of them, people being more aware? Is it mental health being destigmatized and therefore people looking for solutions? What do you think it is that's shifted in the world?
The truth is, it's kind of convergence of multiple factors, as is always the case, probably. But I think firstly, narrowly with psychedelics, I think the work that Beckley Foundation and academics and other groups were doing from the 90s onwards played a huge part. And particularly, I think one of the really interesting elements to this is that there were new technologies in the 90s and 2000s that weren't available in the 50s and 60s. So, for instance, brain imaging. So one of the things that Beckley worked with Imperial College to do, the first ever brain imaging studies on psilocybin and LSD. And what that showed was actually what was going on in the brain during these kind of psychedelic experiences. And what we saw was this down regulation of the default mode network, which is a kind of network within the brain, which is kind of associated with one's basic sense of self, the cycle of thoughts that one goes through if one's in, as it sounds like, default mode. So if you're driving the car and you're kind of in default mode, there's often a cycle of thoughts. It's your relationship to the future, to the past. It, in an incorrect but very simplistic way, it's kind of what maybe people would talk about as the ego in the old days.
Right. Yeah.
But what we've seen in brain imaging is a kind of reduction of activity in that network and an increase in connectivity to other parts of the brain. And so why that was a really, really interesting discovery was that what was also known around that time was that from brain imaging people with addiction and depression, the default mode network is overly active in patients with those kinds of conditions. So if you think that's, for instance, could represent with depression, stuck in a pattern of negative rumination, which is one of the kind of characteristics of depression. Or with addiction, it's obviously kind of being triggered by desire for a substance or whatever it might be. So what this mechanistic study did was it showed a potential kind of mechanism of action whereby psychedelics might actually play a part from a neuroscientific perspective in reducing the default mode network's activity and allowing new connections to be made. And that's, again, the kind of the buzzword in psychiatry now is neuroplasticity. So it's creating this window of neuroplasticity, which allows the brain to change its patterns and kind of behaviors long term. So I think that was the kind of, so that was a level of understanding that we just didn't have in the 50s and 60s. And it to what I was saying before, it kind of really demystified how these drugs were working. And again, that's one example. There's also a lot of really interesting preclinical research on again, showing neurogenesis and all of that. So the kind of scientific validity and almost a kind of rehabilitation of these compounds away from kind of woo-woo to hard science was a major driver, firstly. I think then, as you pointed out, I think within that kind of, that was happening within a context of a growing awareness of the unmet need in mental health conditions. So it's a kind of massive problem that has been pretty taboo for many years. It's much less taboo now than it ever was. So people are kind of much more aware of mental health conditions than they've ever been. And at the same time, that's kind of coincided with a real lack of innovation in psychiatry. So the kind of main kind of innovation that happened relatively recently was more than 20 years ago, which was the kind of discovery of SSRIs, which are kind of selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So they're now the standard of care. That's Prozac kind of thing. So they're the kind of daily antidepressant medications that you can take. And that's really now, if someone kind of comes to a psychiatrist or even a primary health care practitioner, they'll probably get prescribed a kind of SSRIs, antidepressants. The issue is they take a very long time to take effect. So it's normally 6 to 12 weeks before you even know if it's working. They require a daily treatment, which often come with side effects that people find intolerable. And that can be kind of weight loss, it can be sexual dysfunction, it can be a whole host of different things that you're having to live with on a daily basis because you're taking the medications every day. And unfortunately, for many people, it still doesn't work sufficiently either. So there's a whole host of reasons why there was just now it does, just to be clear, they do work for many people, and that's great. But what was clear was that there's a huge unmet need for new treatments that can potentially be more effective, or at least help patients who aren't helped by the standard of care. So so I think all of these things were happening with the kind of momentum of the early research in psychedelics. It was like, oh, wow, this is a completely new class of psychiatric medicine that could be used in a whole range of disease areas. And I think that was, so it was all kind of perfect timing. And there was a kind of general public awareness in this space as well that I think played into it as well. So there was kind of an influx of investment that came over the last 10 years that's really allowed one to kind of massively accelerate the research in this area.
That's a great explanation. And actually, you're right. There's the clinical credibility component, I think, is really interesting. It's almost like, well, actually, let me go one stage back. It's interesting to me, and it's funny that there are these ancient practices of, ayahuasca being taken in the Amazon, or yoga being done in India, or meditation being done in India and lots of places around the world. These things that historically have been proven on, I suppose, to smaller communities anecdotally, but then I guess through time, those communities, it becomes pretty evidence-based that these are the practices that lead to better living. It's only then when we can stick people in an MRI scanner and do a functional MRI and go, oh, we can now see scientifically that these pixels on the screen have changed, and therefore there's, oh no, this is actually all right, this is fine. And we sort of just ignore the fact that there are these ancient practices that have gone on for thousands of years that in some cases I imagine that that have already sort of proved it. It's bizarre. Like,
it's totally, I think you're totally right. And there is a small handful of people, but a sizable one of believers in psychedelics already, right? You can't
Yes.
avoid, which has its pros and cons, but it's definitely, it's those people who have got us at least to the point where now proper research can be done. And I think from their perspective, and I totally sympathize, is in many respects, the aim of clinical development is to kind of prove what's in some extent already known to people who've been using these compounds kind of ritualistically for thousands of years. At the same time, that's, again, I think a massive oversimplification, because actually proving that these drugs are safe and effective and consistent and standardized to pharmaceutical standards that match any other pharmaceutical drug development process is a completely new thing. And it genuinely does take innovation, but also kind of proves things on a scientific level that just haven't been proven before, kind of thing, even if people kind of experientially kind of think.
Yeah, definitely. And I suppose it is as I say, it's just interesting to me and good, I guess, that, functional MRIs come along, they open the door to, hey, this is doing something that's useful. And then all of a sudden it becomes the new field. It becomes cool. You get the early movers, the innovators, and then, the fast followers, and you're all the way down that innovation cycle, which is great. And I suppose, yeah, it is then the role of those scientists to then put the science around it in order to see how effective or what the best conditions are, because ultimately we're trying to direct resource appropriately, aren't we? We're trying to figure out where's best to invest, where's best to create compounds, where is best to do that, because ultimately we're trying to solve a problem. We're trying to figure out all those things, and that's where I suppose I suppose that's where the model goes. When you think about psychedelics as treatment, what does that involve?
Yeah, so this is, I think, again, this is an important point of differentiation from kind of recreational use and what we're talking about as developing these drugs as pharmaceutical medicines. So that, the key thing is that this is standardized treatment, and the way most of the field has evolved, and certainly the way we're looking at it, is the aim is to use a single dose to induce efficacy. So what we're looking at is a single dose of whatever drug. For us, we're looking at 5-MeO-DMT, and we can talk about that in more detail. But essentially, it's the patient would go to a clinic and be under supervision and be given a single dose of this drug. And the idea is that it induces a kind of profound and intense subjective experience. And during that experience, they are under supervision. So they're encouraged to kind of have an inward looking experience, but there are healthcare professionals in the room monitoring them for safety, making sure they feel okay and everything. And so it's a treatment that is delivered in the clinic, right? It's not a drug that you're given and you take at home repeatedly. It's also, generally speaking, there's a concept of kind of psychological support. So patients, because it's a kind of, unusual experience for people to go through, there's this idea that people should be given psychological support for the treatment as well. So that's they're given a certain amount of kind of preparation before going for the dosing session, and then they're supported during the session, and then there's kind of a level of follow-up as well, so that people are kind of there and able to speak to, whether it's a nurse practitioner or a psychotherapist or whatever it is. They are there to kind of unpack the experience and make sure that people are feeling safe and kind of able to kind of go on afterwards. So that's the kind of idea. So it's a kind of container that we provide with the drug. It's the drug, but it's in a clinic in a standardized setting, and there is some preparation and some follow-up afterwards. So that's the treatment. And I think, again, going back to kind of how it differs from the kind of the current standard of care, like SSRIs, the kind of standard antidepressants, so you're given a single dose, and the idea is that single dose can induce a rapid and robust antidepressant effect. So, and we can talk about the data that's been seen in our studies, but also just generally speaking, what we're seeing is with this class of compound that after a single dose, you see a rapid reduction in antidepressant effects within 24 hours. And after that single dose, we are seeing the antidepressant effects last for several months. And so that is, a completely different paradigm of treatment to the current standard of care. So I think I don't believe, I think generally the field expects this to be what you would call kind of chronic intermittent treatment. So we would expect people to need to take treatments every few months or whatever, but that is being worked out. The data there has to be generated to show the kind of maintenance of effect treatment model. But for the initial treatment, 1 or 2 doses within a short space of time seems to be enough to get people into, either into remission or certainly show a response for a large number of people. And that's what's really exciting here. It's rather than having to take a drug every day and then wait for 2 months to know whether it has an effect. Patients will hopefully, if these drugs are proven to work and we can get them approved, will be able to go to a clinic, get the treatment, and within a day, feel significantly better and hopefully still feel better some months afterwards.
Mm. So based on what you said before, the hypothesis there then is that single dose, rapid onset, gets you out of default mode, out of ego. You have this inward-looking experience, to some extent, I suppose, rewiring thinking. And actually the fact that I'm searching for words here and ineffectively finding them is something interesting that I want to talk about. Sort of akin to CBT, almost a CBT, like a rewiring or a restructuring of that kind of thing. It's interesting to me that really does challenge a paradigm, doesn't it? It really does challenge how we think about treating depression, anxiety, other conditions. And I think what's challenging for psychedelics as a space is, for example, I'm anesthetics ITU trained. I'm struggling to find language beyond the words, inward looking experience. I'm trying to say rewiring. I'm trying to find like an anatomical or physiological explanation for something that I actually believe is operating on a completely different wavelength or energy or whatever that we haven't really found a metric for. I think this is acting on a system that we honestly haven't quantified yet or equated. It doesn't have a scale. It doesn't have anatomy or physiology. That's my working hypothesis anyway, because I'll come back to this. The best I've heard it explained is that if you just keep going down and looking smaller and smaller and smaller, at some point, consciousness is atoms contemplating other atoms. So where is that happening? What is that? And until we answer that question of what that is, I don't think we can fully explain through current anatomical and physiological models of explanation what that mechanism actually is. And I think that does hurt, that will hurt the space, because this falls under what we determine as science. Scientists are going to keep, looking for cause and effect in lots of different things. And I think at some point this comes down to something plus something equals life, something plus something equals consciousness, and we don't know what those things are. We don't know how to put that on a scale and a metric, and what the blockage of consciousness is that causes depression, or like on this level that the psychedelics are affecting. That's a bit of a ramble and might not even be understood broadly by anybody listening. But do you understand where I'm trying to get to? And do you have a better way of explaining it than what I've just said?
No, I totally get what you're saying. I think there is a couple of thoughts relating to it. I think basically there is our overall understanding of the mind and consciousness is still fairly rudimentary, and how things work in the brain and how they translate into consciousness is, one's still kind of essentially poking around in the dark there. Now that I think that's a challenge for the entire kind of CNS, kind of central nervous system, and certainly kind of all neuropsychiatric conditions. Whatever drug is being developed, I think the additional complexity with psychedelics is that we know that they induce these profound subjective experiences. So now what has never been proven one way or another is whether those subjective experiences are the driver of the therapeutic outcome, or whether they're a kind of a side effect that one could remove. So I think that's certainly an interesting question that's being explored. Now, I personally have my bias that I believe you will struggle to replicate the efficacy that we're seeing with psychedelic compounds if you removed the subjective effects. So I think we'll see, but I think you're right that in its essence is a challenge to the sector, because it's hard to pin down, because essentially it comes down to subjective experience, which is hard to quantify objectively, which is really the aim of science. So there's definitely a kind of challenge there, and I think the field is trying to come to terms with that and do its best to overcome that immediate obstacle. And we're seeing the kind of resistance to that in various ways. I think what is encouraging is that there are several mechanisms of action that don't require the positing of some subjective experience, that still explain how these compounds seem to be effective. So that's where, as I mentioned, there's this kind of the brain imaging studies, we're seeing the default mode network and downregulation. That's objective science of brain activity. Then similarly, we're seeing in kind of in vitro models, we're seeing that these drugs can induce synaptogenesis. So that's where they create, the brain cells create additional synapses, and that's a kind of underlying physiological base for what we're calling neuroplasticity, which that ability for the brain to create new brain cells and is a driver for being able to change behavior, change patterns of thought within the brain. So there are kind of physiological and neuroscientific explanations for how these drugs are working that you can which could explain it without having to posit the kind of psychological subjective experience as a driver for effect. I think the truth is it's all of those things playing their part together. So I don't think you can decouple them, but you can provide, I suppose, more familiar mechanistic explanations for what's going on when people take these drugs, if you see what I mean.
Yes. And that I do believe helps with the brand of psychedelics as a space and as a class of drugs and things like that. Do you know what it's really similar to actually is anesthetic drugs? Because no one's really got a clue how they work. But what's interesting about anesthetic drugs is that you don't need to really worry too much about how they work or why they work, because at the end of the day, someone does fall asleep, and that's objective. They have fallen asleep. That's objective for everyone to see.
Totally. And I think that's, again, the really important thing here is how the drug works is a secondary question to whether it works and whether it's safe. Those are the questions really that regulators care about. And for the purposes of proving that, there are validated scales of depression, for instance, the MADRS scale, which has been used across psychiatry. It applies as much to a psychedelic trial as to an SSRI standard antidepressant trial. And those are the metrics that we're using to share with the FDA and other regulators. And that's ultimately what matters most, is safety and efficacy by these standardized and validated metrics. And so that's where it is similar to anesthetics. And in fact, my understanding is that's the case for many drugs. Many people, the mechanism of action is not fully understood for many drugs that are used frequently in current standard of care practice. So I agree. And the only other thing I would say is, of course, anesthetics is relevant here as well, because ketamine is an anesthetic.
A dissociative anesthetic. And it's also known, as you said, it's known to be a dissociative. So it induces these kinds of strange subjective experiences in people, and arguably is the first and the prototype of this new class of drugs. So it's actually Johnson & Johnson, or Janssen, the pharmaceutical division of Johnson & Johnson, that developed a drug called Spravato, which is esketamine. It's an enantiomer of Interesting.
Ketamine. And that was the first drug within this class, arguably, to be approved as a treatment for treatment-resistant depression. And so that was a huge step. Again, talking about kind of what validated this space, that was another huge step, that Johnson & Johnson has developed a drug that is now being commercialized. The FDA has approved for treatment-resistant depression, which is a dissociative kind of psychoactive drug. And it's on track to, have over $1 billion of revenue this year. So it's also proving to be a commercial success. And it, again, is delivered within a clinic. So it's under supervision. It's delivered in a clinic, like the drugs that we're talking about. It's also a kind of chronic intermittent therapy. It's more like probably once a week, but still it's a kind of model and a paradigm of medicine, kind of what's now been called interventional psychiatry, which is a kind of change in the paradigm of how psychiatric conditions can be treated. And that's really kind of, I suppose, really laying the groundwork for the rest of the field. And for our sake, it's incredibly helpful and legitimizing that it's not some kind of random company that's done it. It's Johnson & Johnson, one of the biggest pharmaceuticals in the world.
Yeah. And do you know, as you were talking, this is fascinating, by the way. As you were talking there, something that you said earlier came back to me. Is the experience the cause or the consequence, and does that matter? I think that's a really interesting question, because as you were talking there, I was trying to think, like, okay, what's the difference then between an anesthetic drug that no one knows if it works, but it works, versus an antidepressant that's, one shot gives you the experience? The difference might actually be the experience, because that is the bit that's quite taboo, because that's almost like a high, in inverted commas. That's the bit that's criminalized almost. That's the bit that humans are like, what goes up must come down. You can't just have a wonderful experience where you leave your body and have this massive high if you're just because you're depressed, or just because you're this, or just because you're that. Like there's almost that kind of mentality of like, is it fair that person gets to have this high? Like, if you could remove the experience, would people care? Would people care about psychedelics as a antidepressant therapy? Because then you might as well just be taking, like, I don't know, sertraline or anything that you can't really feel. It'd be the same thing if it wasn't for that. So that's the difference, isn't it? And it's like, that out of body psychedelic experience is the bit that causes the challenge. Almost, that is the bit that's different. So that becomes quite an important question, doesn't it?
It is a really important question, and look, it's interesting because people are asking that question, and they're like, "Oh, wait a second. So could you go with a similar mechanism of action? Could you remove the dissociative effects and have similar levels of neuroplasticity and similar kind of antidepressant efficacy?" Now, there are certainly kind of companies exploring that, and I think there's definitely interest from investors and, you know, pharmaceutical companies in that, because in a way it simplifies the question, right? It goes, okay, right, you don't have to deal with that weird subjective experience.
Yeah.
You can the drug. Anyway, so far there is no data suggesting that it is effective in human kind of patients. I think we will, in the next few years, I think there will be companies that are developing drugs that claim to be non-psychoactive, but can be neuroplastogens and can be antidepressants. So we will see if that works. You know, I personally, until I see it, I struggle to believe it. Well, at least to the point where I believe there is a potential for that class of drug to work and have use cases that are relevant.
Yeah. I
believe they will be a very, very different treatment model. It will be very different levels of efficacy. It will be, you know, so I don't believe you'll be able to give a completely unpsychoactive drug to someone for once and then have within 24 hours have very significant antidepressant effects that last for several months. But you know, I hope for patients' sake that I'm wrong.
Yeah, because you feel like their go-to-market might be a bit easier, and getting over the stigma barriers and things would probably be easier. I could talk to you about this all day, but I will just move us on slightly to talk about some businessy stuff and some health tech stuff. But absolutely fascinating. You mentioned that before Beckley Psytech, you grew and sold a company before you started this one. What was that company? What were you doing?
So that was a company called Beckley Canopy Therapeutics, and essentially it was a similar idea, but really when we started out looking for opportunities to develop drugs in a pharmaceutical approach, the first opportunity that presented itself at the time was looking at cannabinoids. So again, you know, the kind of drugs, the compounds that occur naturally within cannabis, but that can be synthesized and can be controlled to the level that they can be developed as pharmaceutical medicines. So we set up a company to do that, to essentially take a kind of pharmaceutical drug development approach to cannabinoids. We launched a trial to start in looking at the use of cannabinoids for the treatment of advanced cancer pain. And so that was a really exciting opportunity. It was an amazing learning experience. And ultimately what happened was a company, our kind of partners came in and wanted to acquire the company in totality, which was great because our shareholders made a very good return. And in addition, we had really already started working on Beckley Psytech. It was what we wanted to, the idea was already there, essentially. And we were able to bring some of the kind of team from the first company who had already formed and worked together for a few years, bring them over to Beckley Psytech. So we kind of got a kind of a running start with this one. And also had some happy investors who would follow us into the next company, basically. So it was a very, very happy kind of series of events in that sense.
Yeah, definitely. So let's take it from the top then. Beckley Psytech. What is it? What do you guys do exactly? Who do you do it for? And what is the change that you want to see in the world as a result of this?
So look, what we're trying to do is help patients, and the way we believe we can help patients with mental health conditions is to develop next generation psychedelic compounds that are safe and effective, right? And so that's the ultimate mission. We think there is a kind of, as we've said, a new paradigm of treatment for mental health conditions that are going to emerge, and we want to play a part. And we started really from the premise that we believe this class of compounds has huge potential from an efficacy and a safety perspective. The big question for this sector, this whole kind of this field of medicine, is how commercially viable and accessible can it be? Because what we're talking about is, a treatment that is delivered. It's an intensive intervention in the sense that someone has to go to a clinic and be under supervision for the entire duration of the kind of subjective experience. And the kind of where the body of evidence existed primarily in 2018, 2019 was for what I call kind of first generation psychedelics. So that's drugs like psilocybin, like LSD, like MDMA. And there's been a huge amount of research on those compounds showing that they can be, when administered under supervision in the clinic, they can be, safe and effective treatments for a range of psychiatric conditions. The challenge is that all of those drugs induce subjective effects that last 6+ hours. Right. So we're really talking about a single patient going into a clinic and being under supervision by one, or actually currently the regulators require 2 healthcare professionals for the entire duration of that experience. So essentially, one patient requires a single room for an entire day and 2 healthcare professionals for the treatment to be administered. And that's just the acute treatment, as well as the kind of psychological support before and after as well. What that means is it's a relatively kind of resource intensive and expensive treatment. And, there is a huge unmet need. There are millions of people who could potentially benefit from this treatment, but that treatment sounds like quite a hard treatment to scale, essentially. So what we were thinking of from the beginning was, could we find next generation treatments that have similar levels of efficacy and safety, but are more accessible, so more scalable as a treatment? And really where our focus then landed was on drugs that could induce these very intense subjective experience, similar to the first generation drugs, and similarly well tolerated and similarly effective, but the overall experience and the time in clinic is more like an hour or 2 rather than a whole day. And if you could do that, it just becomes a much more convenient treatment for the patients, a much more convenient treatment for the clinicians who are having to supervise the patients, and also just a much more scalable treatment because you can fit 4 treatments in the day rather than a single one. So within that room. So that was the idea. And again, I was really lucky from the beginning to work with some people who have a lot of experience in pharmaceutical and particularly kind of CNS drug development. So for instance, the former head of global commercial and market access strategy for Janssen, who had developed esketamine, the ketamine analog we were talking about, was our chief science officer and someone I've been working with for many years, was very, very much involved in the strategy. So he was thinking about patient access from the beginning. And similarly, so we had people like that who really understood the full kind of range and the pathway of getting these drugs approved. It's not just proving efficacy, it's also showing that there is a kind of health economics argument and you can get these drugs reimbursed so that it's the state and insurance companies that are paying for these drugs. So that was the kind of aim from the beginning. And so where we landed was our lead drug is a drug called 5-MeO-DMT benzoate. So it's 5-MeO-DMT is a naturally occurring drug, and known to be a very, very intense and potent short duration psychedelic. So essentially it naturally occurs in the Sonoran desert toad. It's not, yeah, I know. We
Just
don't
images of Homer Simpson
toads.
licking toads and having a psychedelic experience. But
Exactly.
Yeah.
So just to be clear, we don't touch any toads. We make synthetic 5-MeO-DMT benzoate. But the idea is that what we know is it induces these very intense subjective effects, but the overall duration of those effects is normally under an hour. So if we could show that by inducing these experiences and the mechanisms of action underlying those experiences, like synaptogenesis and downregulation of the default mode network, were able to happen in say a 2-hour visit, 1 to 2 hour visit in the clinic, but they could have similar levels of efficacy. So you see these rapid reductions in depressive scores and sustained antidepressant effects for multiple months. If you could do that and kind of match the first generation longer drugs like psilocybin, that would be a huge potential advantage from a kind of clinical and patient access perspective. So that's really what we've been targeting, is this kind of next generation of psychedelics. And so that was our lead asset. We then actually acquired another company to add another asset that meets that same profile. So this one is an intravenous psilocin compound. So we again deliver. Psilocin is actually the kind of active metabolite of psilocybin. So when someone consumes psilocybin, it breaks down in the body into psilocin. We've developed a salt form that's stable that we can deliver intravenously. And again, essentially what it does is it reduces the duration of the experience to kind of under 2 hours. And therefore it's a kind of much, much shorter time in clinic. That's what we're targeting, but similar levels of efficacy and safety. So that's really the kind of the aim of the company. That the first drug, we call it BPL-003. That's the 5-MeO-DMT benzoate. It's delivered intranasally. So similar to the Spravato drug that I mentioned that Johnson & Johnson developed, that's also an intranasal delivery. We basically conducted phase 1 healthy volunteer studies first, and showed the kind of profile of the experience, a very kind of, a consistent delivery of the drug, a reliable induction of these kinds of experiences, and short duration of the experience. And then we moved into phase 2 trials. And so we're targeting treatment-resistant depression as our lead indication. And we're also looking at alcohol use disorder as a second condition to treat. So yeah, so with treatment-resistant depression, we've completed a small proof of concept study in patients, which showed really, really encouraging results. So again, with a single administration of BPL-003, patients over half, this is a small study, right? It was, let's say, 11 patients. But after a single day after dosing, over half of them were deemed to be responders, which means they had reduced their depressive symptoms by at least 50%. And 1 month later, 1 month after dosing, over half of the patients were in remission. So that means they actually no longer qualified as having depression. And these are patients with treatment-resistant depression. So treatment-resistant depression means that you, by definition, have not responded to the currently available treatments. So you have to have failed at least 2 treatments in the current episode. Most of them have failed at 5 treatments in their time and have been suffering from depression for many, many years. So to see a single administration of a drug put half of the patients into remission 1 month after the dose, and still you're seeing the response within 24 hours. And we followed them up for 3 months, and still after 3 months, over half of the patients were still responders, so still reduced by over 50%. So if we could replicate that in larger studies and show it in kind of placebo-controlled studies, then that has a huge potential impact for patients around the world. So that's what we're doing at the moment. We're now running a much larger placebo-controlled study that's got FDA approval. It's got an IND in the US. And so we're conducting that in the US, Europe, and Australia. And that's the big study that we're running at the moment with 200 people or so. And we'll hopefully read that out early next year.
This is fascinating to me. There's a couple of things I want to talk to you about here. The first one is the real practicality, because I straddle the health tech world and the biotech world and somewhat the healthcare world, being an ex-clinician. I sort of envisage things, especially when we talk about pharma and drug discovery and things like that. I try and envisage, like, how does this actually end up all the way to the patient, I think you started there, which I think is really interesting. You actually started with the health economic model of, okay, here's where we are currently and here's the issue. And it's as practical as a single appointment to administer this costs too much money for it to be sustainable and therefore justify the cost when you're treating depression. Therefore, we need to drop the cost. Therefore, what of this can we then control with a different formulation of drug? Can we reduce duration? Can we reduce the need for supervision? And that's where you end up getting to kind of identify what it is you're looking for of a drug, which I think is a really interesting way to start. And it's funny because I contrast this with, I guess, the more traditional, I say traditional, like traditional of late, like AI discovery companies that might identify a target and then run algorithms that are trained on massive data sets and then figure something out, figure out a 3D molecular structure and then go about trying to make the thing, or, that kind of thing. Whereas, again, from that side of things, even from like a business model perspective, you're not doing that. You're doing part of that. You're not having to do that whole thing and go, well, there's the receptor we want to target. That's where it lives on the membrane. This is what we're going to need to do. This is what it needs to look like. We've got this problem and that problem that we need to overcome. It's more that that people are licking this toad anyway and having this relatively safe experience. We now just need to we need to swab the toad, figure out what that is, and then change it to actually make it clinical, to actually make it, okay, what do we need to do to the duration with this? What do you need to do? And I imagine, like, from a drug discovery perspective, correct me if I'm wrong, but I imagine there's a big list of things you could get from around the world of what all sorts of people are doing to have these experiences, and therefore you've got a hypothesis on, where these compounds can be found naturally occurring, whether that is, ayahuasca DMT in the Amazon or various toads and venoms of various creatures and all the rest of it. And then you can go about the discovery element on those. And I don't know, it's just interesting to me from a business model perspective that actually getting to drug might not be as expensive as other ways of doing things.
I totally agree. It's unusual, and we talked about the kind of the challenges that the field faces in terms of having to get people's heads around subjective effects, dissociative effects, and so there's there are challenges to the field. On the flip side, there are huge advantages, as you said. The fact that there is actually an enormous amount of real world data that this class of compound, is generally well tolerated, and there's a huge amount of kind of observational, anecdotal, and now clinical data showing that these compounds are effective in depression. So, whereas from, as you said, most drug discovery companies are starting and spending the first several years getting to the point where you can even try the drug in a human for the first time, having no idea no idea, but lots of questions about the tolerability or efficacy. We have Absolutely. A huge advantage here. We kind of basically have a really strong basis that we kind of can be very confident these drugs will be, generally well tolerated and seem to be effective. So now it's a question of, and so it's a huge advantage. It's proving that in a clinical setting now, and making sure that the setting and the way it's delivered and the drug itself, the way we've the route of administration, etc., is ensuring a kind of safe container for the way these drugs are delivered, and that can be standardized and can go through the classic regulatory process, basically. So yeah, but I think you're totally right. It's a very different, it's almost a back to front approach compared to most drug discovery in that sense. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose you can have slightly more confidence through the first couple of phases of clinical trials as well. You can sort of, you're not as on edge expecting, the unexpected, I guess, knowing that on a Friday, Saturday night, so many people are taking a version of this.
Yeah. To be fair, in terms of clinical trials on 5-MeO-DMT as a compound, there's been very, very little research on this because it's a much less known drug. And so we are kind of breaking new ground from a scientific perspective with this. At the same time, it's a 5-HT2A receptor agonist, which is the same mechanism of action that psilocybin and LSD work on. And there's an enormous amount of research on those drugs. So we are starting from a place of there being a lot of context that we're able to use, and in terms of best practices for how to run clinical trials with these kinds of compounds. So that, there is a kind of class of learning and effect there that we can kind of benefit from. And in fact, it's one of those examples where we believe being second mover, being the kind of next generation, is advantageous because, as you said, there are all these kinds of these hurdles that need to be overcome for these drugs to really create a new paradigm of treatment. And that's, from a regulatory perspective and a commercial perspective, and making clinicians and patients familiar with these drugs as well. And so going second here is an advantage as well, I would say.
Yes, definitely. Awesome. It's fascinating stuff, man, honestly. You talk about, obviously, that asset that you're creating. How many assets are you guys looking at currently?
Yeah, so BPL-003, the 5-MeO intranasal 5-MeO-DMT, that's our lead asset. That's the one that we have a big readout, complete recruitment for that study end of this year. And that's the lead one. We also, as I mentioned, we have an ongoing proof of concept study in alcohol use disorder with that same drug. And we'll have data on that soon as well, which we're really excited about. And then the second asset is a drug called LE101. So this is the intravenous psilocin benzoate drug. Yeah. So and it's really interesting. So essentially, this is the same. It's the active metabolite, I think is the term, of psilocybin. So all the data that's been generated on psilocybin is very relevant here. Once you get into the body, it is the same metabolite that's having the effect. The difference is we can get the drug into the body in a much more consistent, controllable, and short duration way. So we kind of are leveraging all the existing evidence for psilocybin, but delivering it in a kind of much more efficient way that we believe will make it much more scalable. So that study, we've done a phase 1 healthy volunteer study, shown the kind of profile in healthy volunteers, identified the drug the dose that we wanted to take forward into patients, and we've just dosed a cohort of patients with major depressive disorder, and so we're following them up at the moment. Again, very excited to show that data when it's ready. We're confident it will look good. And so then we hopefully move that forward into larger blinded phase 2 studies soon afterwards as well. And then we do have, to your point, a drug discovery program. So we have a library of preclinical drug kind of compounds, candidate compounds that we've tested in preclinical models and have really interesting properties, both from a kind of receptor binding perspective, but also from a kind of disease model perspective in a whole range of diseases. So that next generation that's the kind of generation beyond this generation, if you see what I mean. So these are completely unique, different compounds that we believe could have advantages for particular disease areas, but they're earlier stage, so there's no proof in humans yet.
Nice. Before I let you go, mate, I wanted to just ask you, so fast forward to a time where I guess we're at market with a couple of these assets, and various competitors are also at market, and the world starts to change. Perhaps the stigma decreases. Perhaps this does become relatively routine therapy for certain groups of patients. How do you think the world changes, or what's the sort of picture of the world you're aiming for here? Is it that you expect these to be restricted clinically? Do you see a world where this sort of bleeds more into culture and decriminalization and that side of things? Like, how do you perceive this?
From Beckley Psytech's perspective, we have a pretty narrow focus here. So we are very much focused on developing these drugs as pharmaceutical medicines that will be prescribed and delivered in a clinical setting under supervision for patients with, certified diagnoses in kind of mental health conditions. That is the focus that we've got, and we're very much kind of, not really looking beyond that. I think within that, the vision is that, and we're already seeing to what we talked about before, we're seeing the beginnings of the vision already emerge, which is a new approach to treating psychiatric conditions. And it's this term interventional psychiatry is the kind of new term. So kind of more and more replacing these kind of daily drug intakes that you have to be on indefinitely, replacing those with more proactive interventions that don't require a drug to be taken every day, and in fact are kind of an intermittent treatment, and you go into a clinic. So that's where Johnson & Johnson's drug Spravato, the esketamine drug, that's really laying the groundwork. We are seeing already, there are already networks of interventional psychiatric clinics emerging in the US especially, but also, and there are other modalities, for instance, TMS, that's another example of somewhere you go and get treatment. And so we think that will be a kind of much bigger field and a much more familiar field for people to go to as time goes on, and hopefully by the time we are getting to market, it will be a pretty well established new paradigm for treatment. So I think that is really the vision for us, and we think there is an enormous potential for patients to have better, more effective and more convenient treatments for their mental health conditions. And I think alongside that is the destigmatization of mental health conditions and the kind of focus on mental wellness, I think, is something that's going alongside that. And I think they all play a part together in terms of a cultural shift overall as well. But, we're focused on the medical side.
Awesome. Cosmo, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on. Awesome work, quite frankly. I think it's fascinating what you guys are part of, and very much leading, and I imagine dragging forwards at times, kicking and screaming occasionally. The sector won't always play ball, but and certainly culture doesn't always play ball, but I think you guys are really part of something special. I think it's going to be really interesting to watch. So for those people that want to learn more about what you're up to with Beckley Psytech, or they want to find out more about you guys, what's the best way for them to do so?
We're active on kind of social media, on LinkedIn and Twitter, and also have a website. So that's that. Obviously, also there's and it's BeckleyPsytech.com. But we also, obviously have a load of clinical trials underway. So if people are listening and know people who might qualify for a clinical trial, they're all listed on our website as well. So yeah, please do follow up.
Beautiful. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.